I think it was about Tuesday. I was coughing and spluttering, and Lynn said, "You're going to have to ring to say you can't go." And so, well, no, I'll be all right. I'll make it, and we have. But anyway, thank you for leading, bringing us into our time of worship. So once more, we're at the beginning of a new year. I think I was here last year on the first Sunday in January, but it's good to be here again. But we have this new year, and as we start out in 2018, I wonder what it's going to hold for each one of us. I suppose the truth is, the reality is that we don't really know. We don't really know what's going to happen in this new year. I'm sure there will be happy times for us. There will be sad times, I'm sure. There will be times when things are easy, maybe times when things are quite tough. There will be new life that we see, but there also may be life that is taken away. Maybe those who we know and love. Of course, there will also be wet weather, and of course there'll also be some more wet weather. And you never just know, we might see that strange phenomenon that's summer. You never know, do we? We don't know what's going to happen. But there's one thing that we can be sure of, that we can be totally sure of, and that is whatever happens, God will be with us. God will be there, God will be in it, and God will be part of it, whatever we have to go through. And as we begin this new year, God is here, just as he has been with every new year since the very beginning of creation. And tonight we're going to think about beginnings, since we're at the beginning of a new year, and of course where a better place to start than what we had read to us. In Genesis 1 we read about the beginning. So we're going to look at that beginning, and we're also going to hopefully try and look at two more beginnings that we might face in our life. But we're starting with the book of Genesis, chapter 1. And the Hebrew title for the book of Genesis was simply "In the Beginning." That is what it was called. Of course, then the Hebrew scriptures were in the form of scrolls, which were taken out and read when the time was come for them to read, and the name of each scroll would be written on the top, maybe the first word or the first phrase, so it was instantly recognizable to the person who was collecting that scroll which one they were getting. So Genesis was simply called "In the Beginning." And then when the Hebrew Old Testament was translated a bit later into Greek, they changed the name to Genesis. And the word Genesis means origins or beginnings. So you can see they chose a very appropriate title for this book. Because you start to read Genesis, you see that Genesis contains so many beginnings. It's the beginning of everything, really, isn't it? We see the beginning of our universe. We see the beginning of the sun, the moon, the stars. We see the beginning of plants and birds and fish and all the animals. And of course we see the beginning of human beings. We see the beginning of mankind, and we also see the beginning of man's relationship with God. So we have all these beginnings. And as we start to read this first chapter, they probably start with the most fantastic words that we'll read in all the Bible. Of course, they start with the words, the first four words are "In the beginning, God." In the beginning, God. And as I thought about these maybe simple words, I thought, well, if only the whole of mankind could grasp that statement. If only mankind could grasp and take to heart that statement, what a different place we would live in. In the beginning, God. But of course, this was just not a God. This was the God. In the beginning was the God, the sovereign God, the powerful God, and indeed the all-knowing God. The God who knew exactly what was going to happen, even right at the beginning. So of course Genesis is full of beginnings, but of course it's clear that God himself didn't begin here. You know, God was already there when the Bible account opened. You know, he was already there before the universe began. You might say he was there waiting for the right time to put into action this plan that he has devised, you know, to create all that he had planned. And as you read through this first chapter, it would seem to me that this first chapter of Genesis is more concerned with God the Creator than it really is about the creation itself. In these 31 verses which we read together, the word God appears 35 times. You know, there's no doubt who the Creator was. There's no doubt that it is all about God. And you know, it's not so much a story of creation. I believe it is indeed a picture of the Creator. You know, we see all sorts of characteristics of God as we read these verses. You know, I believe we see a personal God. We see a personal God with a heart that feels, and also a mind that thinks. You know, he speaks out his thoughts. And you know, he has a will, and he makes decisions. And you know, he sticks by the decisions which he makes. And of course that makes God's personality, and that makes God's character. That makes him who he is. You know, God isn't an it that we read about. You know, God is a he. You know, God is a he with feelings and thoughts and motives. And yet he is still a sovereign God and the King of the universe. And of course we also see a powerful God. You know, God speaks things into being. You know, by his words alone, all that we see around us were created. He gives 10 commandments in this first chapter, and every one of them is fulfilled. All his desires are fulfilled. You know, you read through these statements and you think, well, all that was done just because God spoke and said that it would be so. Of course, in this first chapter, we have probably one of the most throwaway lines in the whole Bible, when we have those words that say, "And he made the stars." Just a simple line like that, and yet you go out on an evening like this evening, when it's clear, and you look up and you see the stars and you look at them and you try and count them, you're going to struggle. And yet he just made them. He just made the stars. So of course we do see a powerful God. And of course we see a creative God. You know, living where we do in this part of the world, you know, it's easy to see God's creative abilities. And you know, as I thought about that, you know what an imagination God must have had when he was creating things. You know, it's maybe easy for us to look at things and say, well, yes, that's a hill or that's a tree, and we all know what they are. But of course God had to have the imagination to create and form all these things. You know, no two things the same. You know, no two blades of grass which he created are the same. No snowflakes are the same. No grains of sand even are the same. And of course, no clouds, no stars are the same. You know, all this variety, and yet it all works together in perfect harmony. You know, surely it can't just be chance that all our universe fits together. You know, everything in perfect time with everything else. And yet some would seek to say it is. It's just chance. It just happened. But you know, God had a plan, and God had the imagination to bring that plan into fruition. And of course, in that creation, God thought the world needed one of you and one of me. Once again, each different and each totally unique. And of course, as we read these verses together, we also see a God of great order. You know, everything that he did was ordered. Everything fit into place. You know, as you read this chapter, everything is structured and fits together. Of course, it is spread over 6 days. And of course, these 6 days are divided into 2 sets of 3. In verse 2, we read that the earth was formed, but of course it was empty. But of course, from verse 3 onwards, God starts to give this earth which he has made its form. He starts to form it as he had imagined it. And you know, in the first 3 days, he starts to create all these different environments, all these contrasts in the environment. You know, he makes light and darkness and sky, and from ocean and land from the sea. You know, he makes all these environments, and then of course we read that he fills it with plants and trees and grass. You know, now the earth has form. Now the earth is starting to look like what he wanted it to look like. Then of course on days 4, 5 and 6 he starts to fill these environments which he has created. Once again with great order. We read about the sun and the moon and the stars created on day 4, which correspond with the light and day of day 1. We read of the birds and the fish on day 5, which fill the sky and the sea of day 2. And of course we read of animals and Adam and Eve created on day 6, which occupy the land which he created on day 3. You know, God is a God of order and a God of precision. You know, everything that he made was precisely as he intended. And you know, you might say he brought order out of that maybe chaos which was starting to be made. All those things coming up on earth, and yet he ordered them and set them in their place. And we read that the earth is full. The earth is now full, and God looks at what he has made. He looked at what he has made, and it wasn't just good as he had said as he'd gone through his creation. You know, he looked at what he has made and he said that it was very good. In fact, I believe it was better than very good. It was perfect. The world which he had made was perfect. It was just as he had intended. Not a product of some chance or some probability. God created it just how he wanted it. And you know, it was all part of his plan. And you know, it was all part of his plan of how he was going to relate to the people that he had created. You know, how he was going to fellowship with those he had created. And as we read on in this book of Genesis, we see this played out. And at first, of course, everything is great and everything is very good. Adam and Eve have this perfect relationship. They have a perfect relationship with each other. They have a perfect relationship with nature, and of course they have a perfect relationship with God himself. And you know, we read that God himself is with them in the garden. You know, what an amazing experience that must have been, to actually have God with them. But that's how it was. You know, what more could they want? You know, what more could they possibly need? Everything which they desired was there. And yet, of course, we know that they messed everything up. You know, they couldn't keep to the simple rules which were set before them. And of course, we read of sin entering the world. You know, the relationship which they had with God is broken. And as you get to the end of Genesis 3, you might look at it and think, well, what a mess. And you know, we have those sad words which God said as he looked down on mankind in Genesis 3, when he says, what have you done? What have you done? You know, what have you done to my world? And you know, as I thought about that, I thought, well, surely God is still looking down on this world and is still saying the same thing. He's still looking at these people which he created, and he's still saying to them, what have you done? You know, what have you done with my world? You know, look what a mess my world is in. And as you get to the end of Genesis chapter 3, it's almost the end of the beginning. You know, the beginning started out so good and so perfect. But you know, we've come to the end of that beginning. But we've also come to the beginning of the end, you might say. Because at the end of that chapter in Genesis 3, we have a promise, and we have a hope of one who is to come. One who would come and bring a new beginning. And of course, we have just recently celebrated that, haven't we? We've celebrated that new beginning when Jesus came to earth that first Christmas time. So Jesus is the new beginning. You know, Jesus is the new beginning. But like God, you know, He also has always been here. If we read in John 1, I'm sure it's very familiar verses to you all. But John 1 and the first 3 verses say, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through Him all things were made. Without Him nothing was made that has been made. And again in Colossians chapter 1 and verses 15 and 16 we read, He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by Him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things were created by Him and for Him. You know, Jesus is this new beginning, but He has always been with God. But you see, now in this new beginning, He has come to earth. He has come to dwell with His people. And once more, a bit further on in that first chapter of John, we read that the Word became flesh. The Word became flesh and made His dwelling among us. And we read that we have seen His glory, the glory of the one and only, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. You know, Jesus came to earth to be with His people. You know, Jesus came to earth to show us what God is like, to show us what His Father is like. And He came to earth to restore that broken relationship, to restore that relationship between us and God. You know, when sin entered the world, it separated Adam and Eve from fellowship with God. You know, they were convinced that their way was far better than God's way. But you know, from walking with Him, we read of how they become self-conscious and they start to hide from Him. They start to make excuses about what they have done and the actions that they have taken. And you know, our sin too so often separates us from God. You know, our sin separates us from God. And you know, until we come to that place when we recognize Jesus as our Saviour and Lord of our lives, we too probably think that our way is best. You know, we maybe hide and we distance ourselves from God. And we probably make up excuses and try and defend our actions and the things which we are doing. When in reality we should be doing the complete opposite. You know, we should be begging for forgiveness from Him rather than making excuses. And we should be seeking to draw close to God and not hiding from Him. And you know, we need to come to that place where we are convinced in our own lives that God's way is far better than ours. You know, Jesus came to set us free from our sin. You know, we read, don't we, of the sin that so easily entangles our lives. You know, it's so easy, isn't it, for sin to come into our life and start to tangle it up. Maybe through just a small thing, where it doesn't take much that it can start to grow, and it can soon take over our lives. You know, Jesus came to set us free from that. You know, he came to be that ultimate sacrifice. And you know, he did it because he loved us. He loved us so much. And you know, just as God created us as individuals, then he loves us as individuals as well. And you know, because of that great love which God had for us in sending Jesus, you know, Jesus bridged that gap that there was between us and God. You know, he came to make a way. He came to open up the door for us. You know, we sing, don't we, that there's a way back to God from the dark path of sin. There's a door that is open and we may go in. And at Calvary's cross is where it begins, when you come as a sinner to Jesus. You know, at Calvary is where it begins. You see that baby that came that first Christmas time, you know, that was just the beginning. And of course, the Christ of Christmas, you know, Emmanuel, God with us, he became the Christ of Easter. You know, that baby who was born would be the king who would ultimately die. And yet through his death he gives us life. You know, Jesus himself said, didn't he, that I have come that you may have life and have it to the full. And you know, through his death, you know, he offers us a new beginning. He offers us a new start. He offers us a slate wiped clean, because he dealt with our sin. He dealt with our sin so that we could be free. But we need to do our part, and we need to come to him and seek his forgiveness. And you know, when we do, we too will have that new beginning. 2 Corinthians and chapter 5 and verse 17 says, if anyone is in Christ, he's a new creation. We have a new beginning. The old is gone and the new has come. And you know, when Jesus died on that cross there at Calvary, you know, he cried out, it is finished. And to many who looked on that day, I'm sure it looked like it was the end. I'm sure it looked like it was the end. But once more, of course, it was just the start. You know, it was all part of God's plan. And of course, on the third day, God raised him from the dead. God raised him from the dead, and he conquered sin and death forever. And of course, now Jesus had another mission, and that involved going back to his Father to prepare a place for those who love him. And you know, when we get to the end of this earthly life, you know, if we know Christ as Saviour, you know, we still have the best to come. We have an even better beginning to look forward to. And of course, this beginning was captured by John as he caught a glimpse of this, which you read about in Revelation. And we're going to read a few verses from Revelation 21 and the first 6 verses, where John caught a glimpse of this new beginning, where it says, and then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth has passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband, and heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them. This will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for all the order of things has passed away. He who was seated on the throne said, I am making everything new. Then he said, write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. He said to me, it is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. You know, in the beginning we read was God. And at the end will be the same God. You know, God doesn't change. He's still the same powerful, sovereign Lord of all. And of course that leaves us with a choice of what we will do with God. You know, we either accept him or we reject him. You know, if we reject him, we remain eternally separated from him. You know, we can't enter that which he has made for those who love him. You know, just as Adam and Eve could no longer enter the Garden of Eden. But of course, if we accept him, you know, what a glorious inheritance he has for us. You know, we will need no more beginnings. You know, we will need no more beginnings because this kingdom will never end. You know, God's eternal kingdom will last forever. You know, if we love him, we will spend eternity with him, along with those who have gone before and all those who are yet to come, who will put their trust and give their lives to him. So as we start out in this new year, I wonder, are we beginning it with God? If we were to write as the book of Genesis at the start of this year, would we write and say, in the beginning, God? You know, we might look as though we are. We might be able to convince those around us that we are. But I wonder, truthfully, are we really starting this year with God? Are we in the place that he wants us to be? You know, are we doing the work which he wants us to do? You know, do we know that peace which only he can give, that all that lies ahead will be for his glory, and all that lies ahead will be for his plan and his purpose? You know, maybe it's time for us to maybe let go and let God, as the saying goes. You know, let God take control of all that we do. Let him be the center of all that we do. You know, let him lead us and let him guide us into this new year. And let him stir us up and move us on so that we can work and serve him how he wants us to. You know, God knows what is ahead. You know, he knows what the future holds. And you know, he longs for each one of us to walk each step of the way with him beside us. You know, what better guide, what better person could we have going before us and walking beside us than the one who knows all things, the one who knows what the future holds. You know, in the beginning was God. And I pray that at the beginning of this new year that we would know him close to us and we would walk close to him. Amen.